there, and welcome back for another lesson in APUS history. Today we're going to be talking about topic 3.11, Developing an American Identity. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss, and I'm glad you're here with me. Go ahead and click down in the description to gain access to some guided notes to help you take really quality notes as you follow along watching this video. We want to stay focused here on the learning objective, which states to explain the continuities and changes in American culture from 1754 to 1800. So we're going to be discussing new forms of national culture and the regional variations, as well as the creative expression of the time period, looking at art, literature, and architecture. And so that's really the outline that we're going to follow. This is one of the more basic outlines. We'll just get right through each of these main points. So to set the stage, this time period, 1754 to 1800, there's just a massive amount of change that is happening in this unit. And so we want to remain focused here on the Enlightenment and the American Revolution as we explain the historical context. So the Enlightenment, you were first introduced to it in Unit 2, but it's also been a large part of the curriculum in Unit 3, as it has provided the foundational basis, the philosophical foundation for the revolution. So as people began to emphasize reason and the ideas of John Locke, like natural rights, those really inspired many Americans to push for the American Revolution. Okay, then we also need to think about the American Revolution. In 1754, American colonists are fighting alongside the British in the French and Indian War. And by 1800, we have the United States of America. And so this is just a massive amount of change in the identity of individuals and the nation. Also look at the estimated population totals. So just over 1 million people in 1750 and well over 5 million people in 1800. What's important to note is that there were significant increases in the population, primarily due to births and higher life expectancy. So while in 1790 to 1800, we know there's around 60,000 immigrants, that's not making up the largest portion of the growth of the nation. Additionally, we see increased diversity, with the largest group being African Americans at 20%, the largest group of immigrants, and they were, of course, forced immigration. Okay, so let's first talk about some national culture and regional variations. So we see in this 50-year span a huge growth in political expression. And so we see the proliferation of print culture. We see lots of pamphlets being produced. We see lots of discussions taking place in taverns and other places. And a lot of Americans are really trying to figure out, what type of government do we want in the United States? So ideas of limited government, individual rights, popular sovereignty, that's a really cohesive way to look at how Americans viewed what they wanted in the political system. We see the development of some pretty consistent core values: individualism, equality, free enterprise, freedom, and justice. Now, these things are going to look different in parts of the nation. However, the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and having hard work to obtain a higher place in life, being aristocracy and nobility, those are some of the core values of Americans at this time. Now, speaking of how that differed regionally, we can look at how the roles of women are going to differ depending on which area of the country you are going to be in. Now, these are generalizations, but if you remember from a previous lesson, the idea of Republican motherhood really affected white women, so that it was the role of women to educate their sons to be future government leaders, to be active citizens and participants in the new political culture. Women needed to educate their sons to do this, therefore women needed to be educated. And so especially in New England, we see the rise of educational opportunities for young white girls. Now, Black women, there's going to be significantly more Black women living in the southern states, and Republican motherhood won't apply to them at this time because they will be doing similar roles to Black men in enslavement. Now, some Black women may have worked more in households, but still Black women were working alongside men in the fields on plantations as well. American Indian women. If you remember back to period one, American Indian women in some societies, it was matrilineal, meaning kind of the line of the family was determined from the woman. And so women held more powerful positions in certain Native American tribes. But as American Indians continued to be pushed further and further to the west, and there continues to be more conflict, men are going to take over many of those roles in the treaties and negotiations. And so we see the roles of women for American Indians, especially in the Western areas, becoming less significant or less prominent. Political participation is also going to vary regionally. For example, New Jersey is going to temporarily allow women to vote. A lot of people don't know that, but about 100 years before women got the right to vote nationally, women were able to vote for a short window of time in New Jersey. We also see how age and property requirements are going to vary depending on what state you lived in. And then one of the other largest areas where we see regional variations developing is around the topic of slavery. And so we see many northern states beginning to abolish slavery, whether that was through their state constitution, just completely abolishing it, or creating some sort of gradual abolition over time. We also remember the Northwest Territory. As that area began to be settled, slavery was not permissible in that territory. However, in the southern states, we see significant increases in the number of enslaved persons, and along with that, justifications for enslavement increased. And so there we see some of the aspects of a national culture developing, while also having those regional variations become pretty significant right away. So let's move on to the second part of this lesson, and that's looking at how this national culture is going to be expressed through art. So let's start by looking at paintings. We can really see the influence of the Enlightenment on art during this time period. We see an emphasis on nature and a more classical way of painting, emphasizing things like order and harmony and unity. We see this with a clear focus on kind of one central figure. Typically, portraits are going to be a really common type of painting at this time. And one continuity that we see is that many American painters are still traveling to Europe for their education. And so they're going to be trained in European styles of painting. And so there still is a strong connection in paintings between Europe and America. However, when those artists who do come back to America do make some changes in the ways that they portray their subjects. For example, it's going to be more likely to be pursuing everyday endeavors. So someone, actively writing a speech. I think there's a painting of John Adams who's in the middle of writing a speech. Also, there's the inclusion of women and African Americans in paintings, which was less likely to be shown in Europeans' works. So some pretty significant painters of the time are listed there. And I want to show you 3 paintings of George Washington, which were, this first one was created by John Trumbull. This next one by Gilbert Stuart. And this third one by Charles Willson Peale. I think you can see pretty easily that there's some pretty significant similarities between these 3 works. We're seeing elements of nature depicted in all 3. We're seeing the hero portrayed very formally in the front. The color schemes are also fairly similar. Now let's look at one of the most famous paintings by John Singleton Copley. Here you can see it's a painting of a shark attack, and you can see that there is an African American depicted in it. It's a very what would you call it? Not an everyday endeavor. I don't think shark attacks are everyday encounters. However, it is less formal than what you might have seen prior to this. Benjamin West. He has a very different style. He did do some of the more formal paintings. However, you can see this is quite different from one of the other ones. It's called the Vagabond Family. And so really showing a typical common person at the time. But the person who is most known for paintings during this time is going to be John Trumbull. And this painting probably looks pretty familiar, showing a really classical depiction of the government workings at this time. It did not happen this way. It was much more contentious, less formal than this. Here we have a Revolutionary War painting by John Trumbull you may recognize. And then he also did the official portrait of John Adams. So I think you can sense a really similar style. Benjamin West is obviously the most unique of them, but there's some really American elements in these paintings as well. Architecture. So once again, we see the impact of the Enlightenment on architecture. And so what the Enlightenment is doing is it's going to criticize anything that is not authentic. And so the prior architectural emphases were on the Baroque and Rococo architecture period, and it was criticized for being gaudy and dishonest. And it was called dishonest because it's hiding the actual structure with ornamentation. So you can see in that picture on the right, it is just beautiful and it's very ornate. But they believed that architecture should return to more primitive origins. So if you look there at the United States Capitol, you can see it looks very formal. This is called the Federal Neoclassical style, and it's emitting the sense of formality and respect. It also affected what types of materials were used. And so in the United States, we see buildings using bricks more typically than fine stone. I also love this image here taken from Pop Chart Lab, where it's showing you the various types of structures in the colonial period. So you can see that that likely many of these homes were being made from brick and have a very formal, a very symmetrical look to them. Okay, our last area here that we're going to talk about is literature. So writers are going to move beyond the Puritan literary style and religious themes. Now, it's not to say that writers did not include religious themes, especially when we talk about Phillis Wheatley. Her poetry often had strong connections to ideas like from the Great Awakening. But we do see a lot more writings focused on science, nature, freedom, political ideas, ideas related to American life. And so we see those changes becoming more a depiction of an American style of writing. So our first example is going to be Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. And this is going to be the highest sold book besides the Bible. So it's a yearly publication that provided some witty remarks, humor, and also really useful information to common people. Next up, as I mentioned, is Phillis Wheatley. So Phillis Wheatley wrote this poetry book that was published, and she was an African-American woman. She becomes known as one of the American poets of the Revolution, and so a lot of her poetry connected to ideas of the Revolution and support for it. She actually coined the term Columbia for the United States. Next up, and her work actually also influenced the growing abolitionist movement. Next up, we have Mercy Otis Warren, and she wrote a variety of styles. She wrote a lot of satire. She wrote political dramas called The Group, and also one of the first historical accounts of the Revolutionary War called The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. And so in her work, she's protesting the British, supporting the Patriots, and recording the historical narrative of the area. And then another uniquely American text at this time is Noah Webster's Blue-Backed Speller. And what this is doing is it's helping to standardize American English. And so it's, putting in the proper spelling. It's a concise method. It is a really good example of American writing at the time. So our last thing today is to look at a few of the witty remarks by Benjamin Franklin in his Poor Richard's Almanac over the years. So some good advice here. Content make poor men rich. Discontent makes rich men poor. Silence is not always a sign of wisdom, but babbling is ever a mark of folly. Beware of little expenses. A small leak will sink a great ship. Speak little, do much. Employ thy time well, if thou meanest to gain leisure. And one of my favorites, fish and visitors stink in 3 days. So these would be the types of things that were included in Poor Richard's Almanac, alongside quite a bit of other very useful information for people. So thinking back on our continuities and changes in American culture, you want to think about how are these ideas continuing on from previous times, like the ideas of the Enlightenment, connection to European art, but then also what changes are happening. So think about the political changes that are influencing American art and how that created some regional differences as well. I hope this lesson was helpful for you. And if so, please like and subscribe.